Ambassador Thomas Reed stood at the observation deck of the United Earth diplomatic vessel, Horizon, watching the stars streak by in rivers of light. His reflection in the reinforced glass showed a man in his 40s, with kind eyes and graying temples. He wasn't what most people expected when they thought of Earth's top diplomat. The ship's calm was broken by the urgent beeping of the communication system. "Ambassador," called out Captain Miller through the intercom, "we're receiving a priority transmission from the Crystalline Empire." Reed's heart skipped a beat. In 15 years of diplomatic service, he had never heard of the Crystalline Empire reaching out directly to anyone. They were known throughout the galaxy as the most isolated and proud civilization, believing themselves above the need to communicate with lesser species. He hurried to the communication chamber, his simple black suit a stark contrast to the gleaming white walls of the Horizon. The room was already filled with this small team: Jack, his assistant, and Maria, the cultural expert. Their faces showed a mix of worry and excitement. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing a tall, translucent figure whose skin seemed to shimmer with all the colors of a diamond. The alien's features were sharp and angular, like cut crystal. "Earth vessel." The figure spoke, its voice melodious yet cold. "By decree of her supreme radiance, Princess Aurora of the Crystalline Empire, your presence is demanded at the Imperial Court. You will be the first humans to ever step foot in our sacred halls." Reed exchanged glances with his team. This wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. "We are honored," Reed replied carefully, using the simple, direct language that had become his trademark. "May I ask what prompted this invitation?" The crystalline being's face showed what might have been amusement or disgust. It was hard to tell with their alien features. "The princess does not explain her wishes to lesser beings. You will arrive at these coordinates within 3 standard cycles. Prepare yourself for proper protocol, if your species is capable of such refinement." The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving the room in silence. "Well," Jack said, running a hand through his short brown hair, "that was friendly." Maria was already pulling up data on her tablet. "The Crystalline Empire's protocol is incredibly complex. Their formal greetings alone can last hours. One wrong gesture could be seen as an insult worthy of starting a war." Reed walked to the room's window, looking out at the vast expanse of space. "How many diplomats have they invited before us?" "None from Earth," Maria replied. "But from what I can find, 12 other civilizations have been granted audiences in the past century. None of them were ever heard from again." Jack's face paled. "They were killed." "No," Maria said, frowning at her screen. "They're alive, but they never left the Empire. Some say they were so humiliated by their failures at court that they chose to stay in exile. Others think the Empire found ways to bind them there." Reed nodded slowly, a small smile forming on his face. "They expect us to either fail their tests or bow to their superiority. But they don't understand humans very well, do they?" He turned to his team, his voice firm but calm. "Get me everything you can find about their culture, their protocols, their beliefs. But also get me the things they don't want anyone to know. Their trade routes, their conflicts, their myths. If they want to test us, that's fine. But we'll do this the human way." "The human way?" Jack asked. "Yes," Reed said, his smile growing wider. "We'll tell them the truth. Sometimes the boldest move in diplomacy is simply being honest." Captain Miller's voice came through the intercom again. "Course laid in for the Crystalline Empire, Ambassador. Should I proceed?" Reed looked at his team, saw the determination in their eyes. "Proceed, Captain. Let's go make some history." The Crystalline Empire's capital world gleamed like a massive diamond in space. As the horizon approached, Reed and his team watched in awe as countless crystalline structures caught and reflected the light of 3 suns, creating rainbow patterns across the planet's surface. "Beginning landing sequence," Captain Miller announced. "Ambassador, they're transmitting their arrival protocols now. It's quite extensive." Maria looked up from her tablet, her eyes wide. 743 steps of formal greeting. The first delegation that gets one wrong is typically sent home in shame. The second mistake is considered an act of war. Reed straightened his simple black tie. How many delegations got past step 1? 3, Maria replied. None made it past step 50. The Horizon landed on a platform that seemed to be made of pure crystal, its surface so clear they could see clouds moving beneath their feet. A group of tall, crystalline beings waited for them, their bodies pulsing with internal light. Remember, Reed told his team quietly, we do this our way. The landing ramp lowered, and Reed walked down first, followed by Jack and Maria. The lead crystalline being stepped forward, its face a perfect mask of disdain. I am First Protocol Master, light through breaking dawn, it announced in a chiming voice. You will now begin the 743 steps of perfect greeting. Step 1. You must. No, Reed said simply. The Protocol Master's light dimmed for a moment, as if shorting out. What did you say? I said no, Reed repeated, his voice friendly but firm. We're here because your princess invited us. Where I come from, when you invite guests, you welcome them warmly. You don't test them or try to shame them. A shocked murmur ran through the crystalline beings. Their bodies flickered with rapid color changes. Purple, red, green, possibly indicating their distress. This is outrageous. The Protocol Master chimed loudly. You dare to refuse our sacred traditions. Reed smiled. We respect your traditions, but we also expect respect for ours. Humanity's first tradition of diplomacy is honesty. Right now, honestly, these protocols aren't about greeting us. They're about proving your superiority. The Protocol Master's body had turned a deep, angry red. You will be expelled immediately. This insult will not. Is there a problem? A new voice rang out, clear as a bell but cold as ice. The crystalline beings parted, revealing a figure that seemed to be made of pure light. Princess Aurora floated several inches above the ground, her form shifting between solid and transparent. Her eyes, when they fixed on Reed, were like looking into twin stars. Your radiance. The Protocol Master bowed so low he nearly touched the ground. These humans refuse to follow the sacred protocols. They insult our very way of life. The princess studied Reed with an unblinking gaze. Is this true, human? Partially, Reed replied, meeting her gaze steadily. We didn't refuse your way of life. We just suggested that real diplomacy starts with mutual respect, not tests and trials. Aurora floated closer. The temperature around them dropped noticeably. You dare to lecture us on diplomacy? We who have maintained peace in this sector for 10,000 years. Peace through isolation isn't really peace, Reed said quietly. It's just avoiding the hard work of understanding each other. The princess's form flickered rapidly, her light pulsing with what might have been anger or interest. Finally, she spoke again, her voice carrying a new tone that made the Protocol Master step back in surprise. Very well, Ambassador Reed. You wish to skip the protocols. Then you shall face something far more challenging. A private audience with me. Now. As Reed followed the floating form of the princess into the Crystal Palace, he heard the Protocol Master whisper to another being. No one has ever survived a private audience with her radiance. Reed smiled to himself. It seemed humanity's unique approach was already making quite an impression. The throne room of the Crystalline Empire stretched higher than Reed could see, its walls made of shifting, living crystal that hummed with inner light. Princess Aurora floated to a throne that seemed to be made of pure starlight, her form becoming more solid as she settled onto it. You are either very brave or very foolish, Ambassador Reed, she said, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. Do you know what happens during a private audience? Reed stood calmly, his hands relaxed at his sides. I assume you're going to tell me, Your Radiance. We will link minds, Aurora declared. Every thought, every memory, every secret you possess will become mine to examine. None have ever withstood this process with their sanity intact. The crystals around them pulsed with energy, and Reed felt a pressure building in his head. The princess's eyes began to glow brighter, like twin supernovas. "Your species has never experienced our mind-linking ceremony," she continued. "Most beings find it overwhelming." Reed took a deep breath. "On Earth, we have a saying: the truth has nothing to fear from examination." The princess raised her crystalline hands, and suddenly Reed's mind exploded with light. He felt her presence trying to pour into his thoughts like liquid fire. But something unexpected happened. Instead of finding a mind easy to overwhelm, Aurora encountered something entirely new. Human consciousness, shaped by millions of years of evolution, countless cultures, and endless contradictions, wasn't the simple thing she expected. Reed's mind was a maze of emotions, memories, and ideas that didn't follow any logical pattern she could understand. When she pushed one way, his thoughts flowed in another. When she tried to grasp a memory, she found herself caught in a web of connected experiences that made no sense to her crystal-clear logic. This is impossible." Aurora's voice shook slightly. "Your mind, it resists." Reed opened his eyes, sweat beading on his forehead, but his voice steady. "Not resisting your radiance. This is just how human minds work. We're complicated, messy, contradictory. It's what makes us human." The princess's form flickered rapidly, her concentration breaking. The mental connection shattered like glass, leaving both of them gasping. "How?" she demanded, actually standing up from her throne. "How can you think like this? Your memories loop back on themselves. Your emotions connect to unrelated ideas. Your very thoughts refuse to follow proper patterns." Reed smiled gently. "That's because we don't believe in proper patterns for thoughts. Each human is unique. Our minds are shaped by our experiences, our choices, our mistakes, and our dreams." "Dreams?" Aurora said the word like it was foreign to her. "You mean the random firing of neurons during sleep?" "No," Reed replied. "I mean our hopes for the future. Our ability to imagine things that have never been. To see something imperfect and imagine how to make it better." The princess slowly sank back onto her throne, her light dimming to a soft glow. "In 10,000 years, no species has ever. You should have been overwhelmed. You should have begged for mercy. Instead, you showed me a different way of thinking." Reed suggested, "Maybe that's why your empire has stayed unchanged for so long. When everyone thinks the same way, no one thinks of new possibilities." Aurora was silent for a long moment, her form shifting between solid and transparent as if uncertain of itself. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Leave me. I must consider what I have seen. Return tomorrow, Ambassador Reed, if you dare." As Reed walked out of the throne room, he noticed something that hadn't been there before, a slight tremor in the crystalline walls, as if the very foundation of the empire had been shaken by this encounter with humanity's unique way of thinking. The next day, Reed found himself in a smaller chamber within the Crystal Palace. Princess Aurora had requested his presence for what she called a cultural exchange. Unlike before, she wasn't floating but sat in a simple crystal chair, her form more solid than usual. "Tell me about Earth's rulers," she commanded, though her voice carried a new note of curiosity. Reed settled into the chair across from her. "That's an interesting story. You see, most of Earth doesn't have rulers anymore. At least, not in the way you might think." The princess's light flickered. "No rulers. Then who maintains order? Who makes decisions?" "The people do," Reed explained. "We call it democracy. People choose their leaders, and those leaders serve the people, not the other way around." Aurora's form shimmered with what might have been confusion. "But that's chaos. How can common people know what's best for them?" Instead of arguing, Reed smiled and began to tell a story. Long ago on Earth, there was a king who thought the same way. He believed he knew best, that his people couldn't think for themselves. But then a sickness swept through his kingdom. The princess leaned forward slightly, her light pulsing with interest. The king tried everything he knew to stop the sickness, but nothing worked. Then one day, a simple farmer came forward with a cure, a common plant that grew in the fields. The king had never noticed it because he never thought common people could know anything he didn't. And what happened? Aurora asked, her voice barely a whisper. The farmer's cure worked. The king realized that wisdom can come from anywhere, and that listening to his people made his kingdom stronger, not weaker. This was one of the first steps toward democracy on Earth. Aurora stood abruptly, pacing the room. Her crystalline form cast rainbow patterns on the walls. But our empire has stood for 10,000 years because of our system. Our hierarchy is perfect, each being in their proper place. Is it perfect? Reed asked gently, or has it just stopped changing? Sometimes the strongest things are those that can bend without breaking. The princess stopped pacing. Like your minds in the linking ceremony. They bent but didn't break. Exactly. Reed nodded. Humans learned that strength doesn't always mean being rigid. Sometimes it means being flexible, accepting new ideas, growing and changing. Aurora was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something unprecedented. She walked to a window and touched the crystal with her hand, leaving a small mark. No ruler of the empire has ever touched the walls before. We float above them to show our superiority. And how did it feel? Reed asked. Cold, she said, but also real. She turned to face him. Tell me more about Earth. Tell me about your worst rulers, your greatest mistakes. Tell me true things, not just the good things. For the next few hours, Reed shared Earth's history, its wars and peace, its triumphs and failures, its struggles and progress. He told her about tyrants who fell and good leaders who rose from common people. He spoke of Earth's ongoing journey to be better, to learn from its mistakes. As he talked, Reed noticed something strange. Each time he mentioned people working together, making changes or learning from mistakes, the crystal wall seemed to pulse with new colors. It was as if the very palace was responding to these alien ideas. Your stories are dangerous, Aurora finally said, but her tone wasn't angry. They make me think about things I never questioned before. Questions aren't dangerous, Reed replied. Not asking them is. The princess moved toward the door, then paused. Tomorrow, Ambassador Reed, I have a challenge for you. One that no other species has ever survived. She hesitated, but somehow I think humans might see it differently. As she left, Reed noticed that her feet weren't floating anymore. They were touching the ground. The Great Hall of Challenges was filled with thousands of crystalline beings, all gathered to watch what they believed would be the final humiliation of the human ambassador. Princess Aurora stood before her throne, her light burning brighter than ever. Ambassador Reed, she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. Before you stands the puzzle of perfect order. For 10,000 years, it has tested the worthiness of all who seek the Empire's respect. None have solved it. Reed looked at the object floating in the center of the hall. It was a complex crystalline structure, its pieces constantly shifting and rearranging themselves like a living thing. The puzzle shows us who is worthy of our knowledge, Aurora continued. Only a mind that understands perfect order can solve it. You have 1 hour. Reed walked slowly around the floating puzzle, studying it from all angles. The crowd watched in silence, waiting for him to begin the futile attempt that had broken so many others. Instead, he turned to face the princess. May I ask a question? Aurora nodded, surprised. You may. What happens if someone solves it? They prove their civilization is advanced enough to join our empire as equals, she replied. Reed smiled gently. And in 10,000 years, no one has solved it. No one. Then with respect, Your Radiance, I don't think this is really a puzzle. I think it's a prison. A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Aurora's light flickered. Explain yourself, human. This puzzle doesn't test worthiness, Reed said, his voice clear and calm. It tests if others think exactly like you do. But if everyone thinks the same way, how can anything new ever be created? You've built a beautiful cage of perfect order, but you've locked yourselves inside it. The crystalline beings began to whisper among themselves. Some of their lights pulsed with agitation, others with what might have been understanding. You dare to criticize our greatest test. Aurora's voice was sharp, but Reed noticed she was standing on the ground again, not floating. I dare to suggest that maybe the real test isn't about solving the puzzle, Reed replied. Maybe it's about being brave enough to question why we need the puzzle at all. He walked closer to the shifting crystal structure. Look at it. It's beautiful, complex, always changing, just like life itself. But you've turned it into a test of conformity. You're so focused on finding perfect order that you've forgotten something important. And what have we forgotten? Aurora asked quietly. That imperfection is what drives us to grow, to improve, to create new things. Reed gestured to the puzzle. This wasn't built to find equals. It was built to prove that no one could be your equal. And that's the saddest puzzle of all. The hall fell completely silent. The puzzle's pieces stopped moving, as if listening. Aurora stepped down from her throne, walking until she stood face to face with Reed. In 10,000 years, no one has ever refused to attempt the puzzle. No one has ever questioned its purpose. She paused, her form shifting between solid and transparent. No one has ever made us think about why we created it in the first place. She turned to face her people. The human speaks truth we have not heard in millennia. We created this test to prove our superiority, but instead, it proved our fear. Fear of change. Fear of difference. Fear of growth. To everyone's shock, Aurora reached out and touched the puzzle. At her touch, the crystalline structure began to change, its pieces breaking apart and reforming into something new. Ambassador Reed has solved the puzzle, she announced. Not by playing our game, but by showing us we no longer need to play it at all. The crystal pieces settled into a new shape, a bridge spanning the space between where Reed and Aurora stood. The days following the puzzle challenge brought strange silence to the Crystal Palace. Princess Aurora had withdrawn into the ancient meditation chambers, a place where rulers traditionally went to commune with the Empire's collective wisdom. But the silence she created wasn't empty. It was full of change. Reed stood at a window in his quarters, watching crystal beings moving through the streets below. Something was different about them now. They walked instead of floating, touched the walls, gathered in small groups to talk. Ambassador, Jack called from the doorway. You might want to see this. Reed followed his assistant to the palace's lower levels, where an extraordinary sight greeted them. A group of young crystal beings sat in a circle, actually sitting on the floor, discussing things openly. We've been watching and listening since sunrise, Maria whispered, joining them. They're talking about Earth, about democracy, about change. Some of them are even telling jokes. She shook her head in wonder. They've never done that before. An older crystal being approached Reed, bowing slightly. Ambassador, I am third scholar of historical records. We have questions about Earth. Of course, Reed smiled. What would you like to know? Everything, the scholar replied, his light pulsing with excitement. How do your people make decisions together? How do you handle disagreement? How do you change your laws when they no longer serve you? More crystal beings gathered around, their lights flickering with interest. Reed noticed that none of them floated. They all stood or sat like regular people. Those are excellent questions, Reed said. But instead of me just telling you, why don't we discuss it together? Share ideas, compare experiences. The scholar's form brightened. Discussion. Together. But that's not how knowledge is traditionally shared in the Empire. Maybe it's time for new traditions, a familiar voice said. Everyone turned to see Princess Aurora standing in the doorway. She looked different. Her light was softer, more natural, and her feet were firmly on the ground. The beings around her started to bow, but she held up her hand. "No," she said quietly. "No more bowing. No more floating. No more pretending we are above others or above change." She walked into the room, joining the circle on the floor. The other crystal beings stared in shock, but slowly, one by one, they sat back down. "For 3 days, I have been in meditation," Aurora continued. "But instead of seeking the wisdom of the past, I listen to the hopes of the present. Our people are ready for change. They have been ready for a long time, but we," she smiled slightly, "we rulers have been too high up to notice." She turned to Reed. "Your humanity's boldness, Ambassador Reed, isn't in your technology or your strength. It's in your willingness to question, to change, to grow. You've shown us that true power isn't in remaining unchanging, but in having the courage to evolve." The third scholar raised his hand hesitantly, like a student. "Your radiance. Does this mean we can ask questions now? Real questions?" "Yes," Aurora replied. "And together, we will seek real answers." Reed watched as the room filled with more crystal beings, all talking, asking questions, sharing ideas. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with new energy, new colors forming in the crystal that had never been seen before. "It's like watching a flower bloom," Maria said softly. Reed nodded. "They're not just changing their laws or customs. They're changing how they think about change itself." As the discussions continued around them, Reed noticed something remarkable. The crystal being's light had begun to pulse in harmony, not in the old way of forced uniformity, but in a new pattern, like a conversation made visible, each voice unique, but part of a greater whole. The silent revolution had begun, and it spoke volumes. 1 month after Reed's arrival at the Crystal Palace, the Great Hall looked very different. The floating throne was gone, replaced by a simple crystal chair at ground level. The rigid rows where officials once floated in perfect order had become a comfortable gathering space, where beings from all levels of society could meet and talk. Princess Aurora stood before her people, her feet firmly on the ground, her light glowing with a warm, steady brightness that felt more real than her former brilliant glare. "My people," she began, speaking without the traditional telepathic enhancement for the first time in the Empire's history. "Today we sign not just a treaty with Earth, but a new chapter in our own story." The hall was packed with crystal beings of all ranks, standing together without the old hierarchical separations. Among them were the faces of those who had once been trapped by the Empire's tests, representatives from other species who had chosen to stay and were now free to return home. Reed stood nearby, watching with quiet satisfaction as Aurora continued her speech. "For 10,000 years, we believed that perfect order was the highest goal. We forgot that the crystals we are made of were formed by change, by pressure, by imperfection becoming something beautiful." She touched the wall beside her, leaving a deliberate mark. "Like these palace walls, we too can change while keeping our essential nature." The treaty document floated between them, its crystal surface shimmering with both Earth's and the Empire's languages. "This is not a traditional treaty of power over territory," Aurora explained. "It is a commitment to learning from each other. Earth has shown us that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes as a whisper rather than a shout, as a question rather than an answer." Reed stepped forward when she gestured to him. "Humanity is honored by this partnership," he said simply. "We look forward to growing together." Aurora smiled. A real smile, not the distant expression she once wore. "The first change begins today. The Empire will no longer be ruled by distance and protocol. We will have a council, made up of voices from all levels of our society. And," she paused, her light pulsing with emotion, "I will no longer be called your radiance. I am Aurora, first among equals, not above them." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. The walls of the palace seemed to sing, new colors rippling through the crystal in patterns never seen before. "Ambassador Reed." Aurora turned to him. "Your boldness did more than challenge our ways. It reminded us of something we had forgotten. That true strength lies not in refusing to change, but in having the courage to begin again. Together, they touched the treaty. It glowed briefly, then split into two perfect copies, one for each civilization. Let it be known, Aurora announced, that on this day, the crystalline empire chose to grow. We were not conquered by weapons or technology. We were transformed by something far more powerful, the simple human courage to question, to think differently, to speak truth to power. As the ceremony ended, Reed watched crystal beings mingling with his team, asking questions, sharing stories, learning to laugh. The old silence of the empire had been replaced by something far more precious, the sound of people growing together. You know, Aurora said quietly to Reed, when you first arrived, I thought my silence would humble you. Instead, your words gave us back our voice. Reed smiled. Sometimes the boldest thing we can do is listen to a new idea. Outside the palace windows, the three suns of the Empire's world were setting, their light catching in the crystal structures of the city. But unlike before, the buildings didn't just reflect the light. They transformed it, creating new colors, new patterns, new possibilities. The Empire's long silence had ended, and in its place, a new conversation was just beginning.